It all boils down to Iran and how far the sanctions will be implemented.
Absolutely. The previous sanctions by Obama administration was on 2.2 million barrels per day of exports to go down to 1 million. The current sanctions includes many other things such as gas liquids, LPG, refined products. It's 3 million barrels per day. So under the Trump administration, you want to remove 3 million barrels per day to zero. If you succeed in your wish, then the price of oil will guarantee to be $100. If you don't succeed, if you succeed 50%, then maybe you can keep it at 80, 85, but it is on a razor edge. Anybody sneezes, the price of oil will jump to $100 a barrel.
The question also is, where do supplies come from now when the Iranian sanctions take effect? I mean, we know the likes of India has said, you know what, we're not taking any oil from Iran.
That's correct. I mean, the U.S. Treasury sanctions are extremely powerful. I always say that the U.S. military is far less powerful than the U.S. Treasury. When they put the sanctions on, if they really want to enforce it, everybody abides by it. It's how much they want to enforce it. So if they want it to go to zero, it might be able to go to zero. We expect that China and India still take some volume, and the U.S. government will turn a blind eye. Turkey will take some, and maybe some get smuggled. But 800,000 barrels per day is our expected export from Iran. That would still keep the market on a real razor's edge. Anything happens in Libya, anything happens in Nigeria, in Venezuela, the prices will go to $100.
So where the sanctions are concerned, do you think there'll be any waivers? Do you think anybody will be exempted?
I think there will be waivers, but I think the Trump administration policy is not clear. I assume that those who are friendly with the U.S., they get no waivers. Because if you're friendly, then you follow what the U.S. says. If you are not friendly and you're going to do it anyway, then they give you waivers so that you don't seem to be in violation of the U.S. sanctions. So I expect 400,000 or 500,000 barrels per day waivers to be given. But as of today, there is zero indication of what will happen. I think there is no real policy in place, and they will make it up as they go along.
And Fereidun, Russia and Saudi Arabia, they've been pumping an extra 1 million barrels a day of oil for a couple months now, since June, I believe. Do you think it's realistically possible to ramp up production further?
Well, the Saudi production today is 10.7 million barrels per day. They can go to 11, so 300,000 barrels per day more. They have a theoretical capacity of 12, but between 11 and 12 is surge capacity, it's not sustainable. And I think a lot of people make a mistake. They think that capacity is sustainable. No, they can go up, but they can't stay. Even 11, they haven't tested before, so these are uncharted territory. The Russians maybe can do another 100,000 barrels per day right above where they are today, but these are the limits. Abu Dhabi will go up to 300,000 barrels per day. A spare capacity is 1.2 million barrels per day. And if you really bring it, produce all of it, it still is not enough. But at that time, with the lack of a spare capacity, the prices will rise by the sentiments of the market.
Yeah, Mr. Fesharaki, I'd like to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier as a follow-up to Yvonne's question here. So you're saying if places like Nigeria or Libya act up, then, as you mentioned, there will really be some constraints here. Can you give us an idea of how much capacity potentially might be at threat, just in case something does happen in those places?
Well, I mean, if you look at what has happened to their numbers up and down and take the low numbers, which has been only a few months ago, I think you can easily see something like about 1 million barrels per day under threat. We also expect another 300,000 or 400,000 barrels per day drop in Venezuela just by the natural decline as a result of the mismanagement of the oil industry. So the dangers on the upside are huge. All the risks are upside. There is almost zero risk on the downside. Anything happening would push the market. And if there's a military confrontation between Iran and the U.S., which I think is a serious possibility myself, then you could see prices $150 or even higher.
So
go ahead, Haz.
Are you concerned about the... I'm just wondering, I mean, just to follow up on spare capacity, this is the lowest we've seen ever.
Yes.
And to anyone's memory,
yes,
there must be some concern about this spare capacity.
Well, the market is very concerned, but, we hear these naive statements from Trump administration that I called the king and told him to produce, and he said, okay, it is not a matter of, if people get rid of the spare capacity, then market would be so jittery. you need to have about 2 million barrels per day of spare capacity to be able to keep some stability in the market. And we're already far below that level.
Mr. Fesharaki, who has the most influence in the price of oil these days? I mean, is it President Trump? Is it U.S. shale producers? I mean, where are we seeing the most influential price pressures here? And where can we look for where to go, where that's going to take us?
Well, I think the mathematics are simple. The shale producers all produce at the maximum that they can, so they haven't hidden any spare capacity that they can bring on. And by the way, 2019 will be a tough year for the U.S. shale producers because of the infrastructure which has to be built. The lack of send-out capacity requires that actually exports will be less. The production will be less growing next year than this year. But the key issue to look at is that how much of the enforcement of the sanctions we're going to see. Full enforcement, $100 plus. 50% enforcement, maybe $80, $85. That's basically our gauge, is how much will the US administration enforce their own sanctions or not.
And Mr. Fesharaki, what's your view then of how much they will want to push those sanctions?
Well, the Trump administration has put themselves in a no-win situation. If they want to push Iran to zero, then they have $100 oil, and everybody sees the Trump administration as the reason for it, not OPEC. It's absurd that the president calls OPEC and he says, your fault that the price of oil is up, and why are you ripping us off? So it's really their decision. In my view, at the end of the day, they have to turn a blind eye, otherwise the prices will go at the levels that they cannot explain to the world.
So when can we see OPEC and its allies rebalancing the oil market, and what tools are available?
I think that unless Iran production is 1.5 million barrels per day or more, it's not possible to rebalance. This will continue. This will be jittery for a period of time. It has to be something which requires, we cannot go ahead without Iran production. And please remember that between 2015 and 18, we've added 6 million barrels per day to global demand. Have we found 6 million barrels per day of new oil? We haven't. Have we built 6 million barrels per day of new refineries? We haven't. Today, every part of the oil industry is making money. Upstream is making money, downstream is making money, midstream making money, natural gas making money. So happy days for the oil industry. But what happens with this administration is that everybody makes a lot of money except the Iranians and the Venezuelans.